Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to American Arms Channel. On today's podcast, as you can tell by the title of the podcast, we are going to talk about lessons on the 10 gauge. Now, this is pretty much going to be just an open mic rant from me as I travel. So, hopefully this recording will come out nicely. I'm currently traveling at 70 plus miles an hour down a highway in my pickup. So, it sounds like we're going to get some good audio, but who knows? I may just be talking to nothing and no one for 45 minutes straight and have nothing to show for it. But anyways, at least it'll keep me entertained, right? So today we're going to just ramble on about what I have learned about the 10 gauge and some, I believe, pertinent points or facts that I have come to know, discover, or are just something that I have to know from my experience in the past year and a half plus now with the 10 gauge cartridge. So we can talk about everything from guns to loads to factory options, etc. But really, I think the question is where to start. And for me, it was why the 10 gauge? Now, my thought process behind obtaining a 10 gauge originally was that I wanted larger charges of large steel shot. What I was finding was that during early season, close quarters, small ducks, number 3 and number 2 shot was very much acceptable and had the pattern density to do the job when looking at steel as a shot material. Now, when it got to later season, I found that I had a lot of inadequate performance over the years with anything smaller than 2. 2 didn't always drop ducks, but number 1 seemed to do a slightly better job at the same ranges. And of course, BB was excellent. But in a 12 gauge, even in a Super Magnum, which out of a lighter gun, again, kicks pretty hard, you don't get a very substantial pellet count. So, my thought process became, well, why not go to the heaviest load of BB or B shot that I can? Well, honestly, the best you can get is about 1 5/8 ounces, but here's the trick. That's a Fiocchi Golden Goose load, and it comes in 2s, BB, triple B, and T-shot. Now, I tried the T-shot out, and let me tell you what, T-shots in steel will knock the crap out of some snow geese and Canadas past 50 yards. But the trick is getting it to pattern well, and the best patterns I was able to achieve were typically out of improved cylinder or modified chokes, but I had a lot of signs of bridging and sporadic patterning, large holes in the pattern, which didn't give me the long-range performance that I desired in late season, even if it was a butt stomper of a load up close. So I wasn't obtaining what I wanted, and also out of a 7.1, 0.2 pound Super Black Eagle 3, it kicks like a mother. That 1430 foot per second box rating on that 1 5/8 ounce load, yes, is faster than factory 1 5/8 ounce 10 gauges, but in a gun that weighs far too light for it. And yes, I did try it out of heavier Super Magnum guns. It still was an unpleasant load, and I found the muzzle blast to be significantly distracting compared to other lighter loads, even in the Super Magnum. So, that put me on a path to consider buying a 10 gauge just for late season. And so with that, I started researching, well, what is available? Well, there's nothing really but the Gold 10. So the semi-automatic Gold 10 seemed like a good place to start, and there really was not a lot of information out there about it. But what I did find was a lot of 10 gauge fanatics on older forums, and even at the time, current forums, raging about how well the large shot patterned out of a 10 gauge, and that improved cylinder modified and improved modified patterns were lights out better than anything that could be expected out of a 12 gauge, even an overboard 12 gauge. So my curiosity was piqued, and I decided to go down the 10 gauge path. Now, I sort of fell away from that when I started to use copper plated bismuth from Boss. after my first few experiences with using it, all I knew was that this stuff works, and that out of a 3-inch 12-gauge shell, I can pick a number 2 or a number 3 shot size and butt stomp geese, so long as I'm on them with my pattern, pretty dang hard out to 45, even 50 yards. Again, the pattern would be the driving core on how effective that load would be. And of course, if you have to body shoot them or it's late season, number 2s would be ideal. But then I found out after my first season with Boss that in 2020, Boss would be producing a 10-gauge load. Originally advertised at an 1.75 ounces at 1,350 foot per second, it was definitely going to be a better load just from the copper-plated bismuth compared to the bare bismuth of a, let's say, heavy shot 10-gauge load, which has been on the market for a little while at least. So I was full in. Little did I know that Brandon Surecki himself would get a little bit mad with the loading and really want to replicate those 2 to 2.25 ounce lead 10-gauge loads, and putting a 2 1/16 ounce load at 1,300 foot per second box rating, which actually in standard ambient temperature, which is pretty much above 45, 50 degrees, would be 1,325 or more, and in hunting conditions about 1,290 to 1,300. So right on the money there. Offering it in number 4s, number 2s, and number 1s. So I was ecstatic, and I bought a lot of it last season. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. What I'm meaning to say is that basically shot material made me reconsider utilizing the 10 gauge because I was getting better results out of a smaller gauge with a heavier, denser shot material that performed significantly better than anything else I had ever known before. You're going to remember, guys, I was born the year after the steel shot mandate went into effect in the U.S. and Canada. So really, there was no experience for me because everything else growing up was far too expensive and steel shot just consistently underperformed. So my thought was bigger and bigger steel shot, and you need a 10 gauge to do that, right? Well, let me say that primarily the 10 gauge drive was for geese, but after having hunted ducks with it and having taken a duck with it and taken some mergansers with it, I can say that if you adapt the 10 gauge loading to what you are chasing, you're going to have a fantastic time of it. And yes, because we can't run short shells or 2 7/8 inch length shells at 1.25 ounces to 1.5 ounces, we kind of lose the ability to have a quote-unquote dedicated duck load out of the 10 gauge. But you can run higher velocity if you hand load. 1.5 ounce bismuth loads, 1 3/4 bismuth loads are more available. But even so, just open that choke up. If you're utilizing Boss, for example, that 2 1/16 ounce of number 4s is a pretty nasty duck load out past 30 yards. I mean, really, 35 yards and past is what you'd want to be using that load for. But inside of that, I mean, I don't know why you're holding a 10 gauge, but you know what? Sometimes you expect them to be far and they don't. So, shoot for the head or open the choke up a little bit. Anyways, but really the whole 10 gauge process, once again, just revolved around being able to throw a higher payload, a denser pattern of bigger shot. And even in a denser material, that's still the case. I absolutely love the number 2 bismuth load and the number 1 bismuth load from Boss in the 10 gauge Magnum. It's just a fantastic load. And if you do your part and you've got the right choke in your gun, or you've patterned your gun and it works well, if you've got a fixed choke gun, whether it's a double barrel, single barrel, or semi-automatic that's not removable choke system, it's going to be exceptional. I mean, it's just going to be a great performer inside of the operating realm of the 10 gauge. Now, with steel shot, even then, I was worried about later season ducks where I was typically taking 35 to 45 yard shots. Number 1 steel seemed to perform the best, but I liked the idea at the time when I was still shooting steel shot primarily, and I do shoot it on snow geese, but I've replaced it with bismuth for all of my regular season needs. But at the time, I was considering that the number 2 1.5 ounce to 1.6 ounce load was a great heavy density pattern that I could run an improved cylinder or modified with and give myself a lot of forgiveness. I could also throw the improved modified or full into a gun and really get a nice pattern that's duck dense enough to really strike down big fat mallards in late season out past 40 yards. And for me, BB at about 1400 or a little bit faster or a little bit slower was ideal. At the time, I was a speed freak. I was like, it's got to go as fast as it possibly can. Well, science it says that that's not always going to provide you the best benefit at the distances that you're trying to operate that cartridge, the 10 gauge. So there's that. But once again, the whole driving principle behind the 10 gauge and behind my reasoning for a 10 gauge was larger payloads, denser patterns, greater range. That's what I wanted. And I wasn't looking for 80-yard kills with a 10. I just wanted that 55-yard game and in. I just really wanted to know that I could absolutely devastate waterfowl if they came into decoying range or they just came within gun range. So it was more born out of a frustration with steel shot than it was out of an absolute need to utilize the biggest bore I possibly could. Having said that, I am glad I piqued my interest in that way, because everything that I thought about the 10 gauge still applies no matter the density of the shot material that you're utilizing. Whether you're using steel, bismuth, heavy X, tungsten iron, tungsten polymer, ITX10, ITX13, heavy shot, TSS of any flavor, apples to apples, the 10 can throw more shot down range, bigger shot down range with typically more dense, even patterns than smaller bores, even the Super Magnum 12 can. There will be situations where they are neck and neck, or sometimes the Super Magnum 12 gauge comes out ahead. But there is something to say about the practicality of the load inside the parameters of the Super Magnum 12. Not so much because the guns can't handle it, but because, honestly, we can't handle it that much. And I love high recoiling guns. I really do. They're a lot of fun. But after a while, you start to feel it, and you will develop a flinch. And that is counterproductive to wing shooting. So if the ultimate goal is to make better, cleaner kills in the guise of waterfowling and wing shooting, why would we put ourselves at a disadvantage? Now, a 10 gauge pushes you around a lot. Yeah, but it pushes you. It doesn't punch the shit out of you. So there's a big difference between firing an 1.5 ounce or a 2.25 ounce load in a Super Magnum 12 versus firing the same load in a Magnum 10. Really, when you take a look at it, it's like, okay, it's just physics, guys. I'm pushing the same charge weight at the same speed or faster than the 10 gauge out of a 15, 20, 25% lighter gun. Ouch. I mean, especially when you start considering fixed breech guns or inertia guns. I mean, it's kind of, it's kind of hard hitting. I mean, one of the softest semi-automatic Magnum guns that was ever made was the Ithaca Mag 10 and its descendant, the Remington SP10. Why? Because the damn things weigh 11.5 pounds. they're gas operated. They soak up recoil, and they're able to throw just absolutely brutal shells down range with very mild impact to the shooter. Again, you pay for that if you're trying to hike around the mountains with it, but it's not entirely what that gauge is intended for. I mean, back in the day, a 10 used to be an exceptional fouling gauge. It was carried everywhere, but even those guns were a little bit heavier, but people accepted that for the higher payload and the larger bore and the better patterning of slightly larger shot. A lot of what we press a modern 12 gauge shell into today was the original realm of the 10 gauge in the black powder era. So you can probably see the picture that I'm painting here is the same thing you'll find when you start doing general research online. Now, guys will argue back and forth. The Super Magnum will do this, that, and the other thing. I would be hard pressed to say that a lot of the guys that claim the Super Magnum 12 does the same or is just as okay or just as good or whatever, however they want to phrase it, as the Magnum 10 really put a lot of rounds down range with the Super Magnum. Now, I can't say that I've put a buttload of Super Magnum loads downrange with the 12 gauge, but I can say that I've digested through my Super Black Eagle 3, through an SX4 Super Magnum, and a host of other guns here and there. I've shot probably right around 400 plus shells if I had to take a stab at it of Super Magnum. Now, a lot of those are going to be lighter ounce and 3/8 steel loadings, etc. But, I've had some significant trigger time, and those loads generally high muzzle blast, a lot of recoil impulse, and they don't give you that much better performance and behavior in the 12 gauge as does a loaded to the tits, topped out 3-inch Magnum. So there is that. To me, and when I was using them, and still, the ideal behind the 3.5-inch Super Mag 12 was to push slightly more shot, slightly faster. So instead of throwing 1.25 ounces at 1,500, I could throw 1 ounce and 3/8 at 1,550. I thought that was ideal. I probably would have been better off throwing 1.5 ounces at 1,400, which would have been a much milder load and would have been actually probably a better performer with the larger steel shots, because you don't get that increased exponential increase in drag on those spheres. So we'll go into that in a second, and I know that'll be rehashing for some of you who are up to speed on basic physics and ballistics of a sphere, which is what shot is. It's spheres of metal. So really, what I found was, I got some great results close in, harder hitting than ever, but when I really boiled it down, the Super Magnum with steel was not doing it at all. Now, in the guise of a turkey load, in the guise of something that's a low volume cartridge, meaning that you're not going to shoot it as much. Wing shooting's high volume, guys. It doesn't matter if you're making one bird shot, compare 6 shots for 6 ducks to 1 shot for 1 turkey. That's higher volume. So, and while that won't bother you, if you're a serious waterfowler and you live in an area where you could potentially take 100 plus birds in a season, whether you're a great shot or not, you're going to shoot a lot, right? We all buy a case before season, we shoot some shells to pattern and play with and get used to it, and then we go to town and hunting all season with them. So it is a high volume hunting sport. It really is. So I found that it really wasn't a benefit for me to run the Super Magnum. Now, when it came to the 10 gauge, in my experience with the 10 gauge, I found that, you know what? The less jarring recoil impulse, the higher payload potential, the better patterns with big shot type, again, regardless of material and density of that material, it just was a better performer, partly because of the cartridge being larger, the bore being larger, but also because the gun weighs more. So I think I've gone in circles 2 or 3 times now describing to you the advantages, and that really is the advantage. Now, if we are looking at this through the lens of reloading for the 10 gauge and optimizing the cartridge, or creating loads that are optimized or well balanced, because we can always create some monster loads, and I do have one resource that is absolutely creating god-awful loads. Let's say a 3-ounce lead load at 1,200 foot per second, and that is that is a significant payload, to say the least, and a significant velocity for that payload. Field report is, did a great job on an off-center shot on a turkey, but it is a butt stomper of a load, and he's shooting that out of a 24-inch Gold 10, which is like a just over 9-pound gun. Woof. Absolute woof. I don't think he has a limb saver pad on that gun, which is even more of a holy shit kind of moment. I will play with that eventually, but I've developed enough of a flinch from the 2.5 ounce 1,200 foot per second turkey load. 2 3/4 sounds better to me, just more well balanced. But honestly, when we look in the guise of lead for turkey, which is a great example, talk about a well balanced load for a stationary target or semi-stationary. We're looking to put a lot of pellets on the pattern board and a lot of pellets in that small target, that head and neck area of that turkey. But if we're going to use lead, well, number 5s are like the perfect shot size for a lot of turkey hunters, right? Number 6s are not enough. Great pattern density, but in great forgiveness with a little bit more open choke at closer range, but not enough really for consistent performance at more extended range. So if you're wanting that 70, 75 yard lead turkey load, you're going to have to do some choke work and some load development work for your gun. But generally, it's very much possible to get to that 60 plus yard mark with a 2.5 ounce number 4 nickel plated lead load. Now, can you get 2.5 ounce lead loads for the 12 gauge Super Magnum? Yes. In fact, Fiocchi makes a non-buffered nickel-plated golden turkey load at 2 3/8 ounces at 1,210 foot per second box rating, and that's a butt stopper of a load. That's a great turkey load, but once again, your shoulder is going to pay for it even if your wallet doesn't. But highly recommend that load if you're looking for something that's very affordable and is something that can really allow you a great 50-yard in lead turkey load at not a lot of expense without having to go the TSS route. TSS is a completely different animal, and I've not ventured in that, so I'm not going to comment too much on that. But again, for me, in development of my quote-unquote Turkey Thunder load, there was a lot of potential to push higher, but I wanted a certain velocity and I wanted a certain range because I'm trying to balance payload with lethal distance, right? I can put a lot of payload in a shell and end up reducing my lethal range because I've slowed down that pellet too much. So there is the balance there. And this is the same with every shot shell cartridge. Doesn't matter the gauge. But with the 10 gauge, we're looking at the most we can put in it because commercially there are not 8 or 6 or 4 bores. Those are kiln guns or custom manufactured pieces, and they're not a practical hunting piece. The Mighty 10 is about as portable and practical as you can get while still boosting that high charge weight. So in the realm, the context, the lens of turkey hunting, yes, boosting up to that 2.5 ounce payload, 2 3/4, or even 3 ounce, if you're able to safely push up to velocities that give you that range, is a great idea. Now, when it comes to buckshot loads, 2 1/4 to 2.5 is fantastic, and because of the increased size of that pellet, the 10's going to accommodate that increase in size very well. So quad-aught loads, large charges of number 4, number 3, number 1, number 2, aught, double-aught, triple-aught. I mean, the 10 loves it all, right? You just got to choke it right. Find the choke that it likes if you've got an interchangeable choke gun. But typically, you're able to throw that stuff down range at the lighter end of 2 ounces at like 1,400, 1,500 foot per second. If you really, really want to push it, 13 to 1,400 is great. 2 1/4 ounce, 13 to 1,400 is going to be great. You're going to feel it on your shoulder. 2.5 ounce, 1150 to 1250 is great. And above that, you're going to struggle to get a lot of pellets in there, and you'll see a significant diminish in velocity. So the 2 to 2.5 ounce range for the 10 Magnum is perfect with buck. But again, we're thinking more in a stationary situation, something where we're probably not shooting at an animal that's running through the brush faster than 15, 20 miles an hour. We still have to consider that and shot string and capability to put that load on target, but in the end, it doesn't matter quite as much. Now, when it comes to wing shooting, now we are in a different ballgame. Now, shot-to-shot recovery is even more critical for follow-up shots, both to land poorly hit or crippled on the wing birds, as well as to be able to simply take more birds per run. I mean, a lot of the point of a 10 gauge is to drop a bird right away, as well as give us more opportunity to be more efficient with our shots, even if it does cost us more, which is, again, another reason to be more efficient with your shooting and with your shot charge. So there is that. Now, when it comes to lead, back in the day, typically a 2-ounce lead load was your minimum, was your standard. It's what the 10 gauge Magnum was based around. But if we're to look at it with a lens of, well, what did we eventually end up with? There were a lot of 2 1/8, 2 1/4, and 2 3/8 or 2.5 ounce even goose loads. But pretty much factory standard before the steel shot mandate was a 2 1/4 ounce, 1,300 foot per second load of number 4 lead or number 2 lead, copper plated, was the premium creme de la creme of a 10 gauge shot shell. You can still sometimes find the late 80s production Federal or Winchester boxes of waterfowl loads that still have the duck or the goose on them. They carried that over to the early, the packaging style, to the early tungsten iron loads, because they were hearkening it back to, this is like lead. That's just a little contextual deal there. But those loads were highly effective and favorites of Mighty 10 owners. Primarily, you were either shooting a double 10 or you were shooting an Ithaca Mag 10 at that time. So when we moved to steel shot, 1 3/4 became the norm. Now, could we today develop 1,350, maybe even 1,375 or 1,400 foot per second 1 3/4 loads? I think it's doable. The problem is nobody wants to undertake producing a wad that is properly of the proper height and playing with powders and stuff, because the 10 gauge is just, from a factory standpoint, far behind the 12 gauge, far behind the 20 gauge, even behind the 28 gauge, in my opinion. I think, honestly, the 16 gauge and the 10 gauge live in the same space. They are forgotten about gauges factory, and they are still produced in non-toxic loads by the big manufacturers just to keep the market there, so that they don't open up any sort of boutique market, which still exists. But I think it's more of they see it's more of a service to those people than a producer-consumer relationship, because they do make up a very small part of the wing shooting shot shell market. So there is that, and if they were able to develop better wads and better loadings for those gauges, I think you would see them increase in popularity. But I think there's also something to be argued that they don't want to have to mess with all the tooling and all the investment in design, etc. The funny thing is, though, Federal did go through the whole process of creating the flight control wad system for the 10 gauge. So, what gives there? You could definitely increase the height and play with getting a 1 3/4 in there, or it's not a lot of pellet increase, but it is possible. But anyways, the original steel shot loads were 1 3/4, and those performed adequately. But the best 10 gauge loads started coming about with high velocity 1.5 ounce and 1 5/8 loads. Now today, if you're buying steel shot, I would say that your best 2 loads are going to be in BB, at least from what I've seen with performance, and they're going to be the Federal Black Cloud at 1375 box rating and the Winchester Double X 1 5/8 at 1350 box rating. So, those 2 options are what there are for steel, and definitely there are better performing materials than that. But that's where we've landed after basically 20 to 30 years of development / non-development. I mean, the wad designs are good, but they're still just straight wall shot cups. I mean, the Federal Flight Control wad is obviously a very good wad. But the 10 gauge has seen very little development process comparatively to the 12 and the 20. So there is that to consider. Now, in the realm of hand loading, though, the balance is completely different. Honestly, you can get that 1400 plus foot per second with the ounce and 5/8 steel load. You can achieve with 2 ounces, ounce and 3/4 to 2 ounces plus of other non-tox, more dense non-tox loads, 1300 foot per second plus, and that's going to really give you a lot of great pattern density and really high effect on target. So we could push the limits more, but we're going to push the 10 gauge outside of what we call a reasonable squared off load. And that doesn't mean literally square, like the 16 gauge is perfectly square 1 ounce lead load. We're talking more in the context of I want it to be a reasonable shot charge. The guys that argue a Super Mag 12 will do what a 10 does, yeah, it can sort of do that, but you're pushing that load so far out of the parameters of what makes a 12 gauge ideal that it's just ridiculous. I mean, there's an argument to say that an ounce and a half load of bismuth in a 12 gauge is excessive and not reasonable. I mean, is that the case though? No. I mean, the 3-inch Magnum ounce and a half bismuth loads are fantastic. The 3-inch ounce and 3/4 lead loads are fantastic. I mean, that's kind of the 12 gauge standard for turkey hunting when it comes to lead. The ounce and a quarter to ounce and a half buckshot loads are great. I mean, we can push 2 ounces of lead inside of a 3-inch 12 gauge, but that's kind of pushing out of the parameters of what's reasonable for that gun. So when we go to the Super Mag and we start throwing 2 to 2.5 ounces out of that gun, in lead, it doesn't make a lot of sense. We start throwing an ounce and a half to ounce and 5/8 out of that gun with steel. It doesn't make sense. An ounce and 3/4 of bismuth wouldn't make sense. It's just you're not seeing an exponential increase in performance versus the exponential increase in recoil and cost. So there's the end of it. It's just like with the 20 gauge. Yeah, you can stuff 12 gauge heavy field loads inside of a 3-inch 20, but you got a lighter gun with a heavy charge weight at a little bit less or the same velocity, and it's a smaller bore. So ideally, your pellets will be a little bit smaller for that charge weight, and you're not seeing the efficacy drops off, really. Maybe the better way to put it is that the efficacy of these loads becomes very much questionable. Yes, they work, but it's just like you'll read about the demise of the 16 gauge and how when we went from 1 ounce loads to an ounce and an eighth and even an ounce and a quarter field loads and magnum loads in the 16 gauge to compete with the 3-inch 20 gauge, the guns became just brutal on recoil. And that's when we started to see 20 on 12 frames. And the 16 gauge was fading away. It's because those shot shells were out of balance. The efficacy was not there for the charge weight. If you're shooting a 20, shoot a 20 gauge load. If you're shooting a 28, shoot a 28 gauge load. A really good wing shooter that appreciates or sees a variety of wing shooting opportunities during their hunting season should probably look at owning more than one gun. One of the problems that we see in the wing shooting world is that there has been this idea sold to everyone that they will be able to buy the last gun they'll ever need. And yeah, a Super Magnum 12 will probably be the only gun you would ever quote-unquote need, because if it's built right, you can cycle 1 ounce all the way up to 2.5 ounce loads out of it. You can kind of do what a 20 gauge can or a 28 gauge can, and you can kind of do what a 10 gauge can, but again, it's going to live in the 12 gauge space. So if that's what you need and you're not interested in having an arsenal of gauges to adapt to whatever sort of situation might be applicable, then by all means, go ahead and get a Super Magnum 12 and be happy. But if you're looking to be able to fill those niches, to me, everything from 28 to 10, and I exclude 410, it has its place. I joke, I think it's a snake gun. It's definitely got its challenges. It's a great short-range gun. It's a great little pop gun. It can kill ducks and geese. We see that. And it can kill turkeys, of course. It just depends upon shot type. But to be honest, ideally, 28 and bigger. So, and we'll talk about 28 gauge on a different day. But you can even argue between a 28 and a 20 gauge. I mean, I can run a 7/8 ounce non-tox load that's heavier than steel. So bismuth at an ITX 10 at minimum in the 28 and be 7/8 ounces and have the same payload as a field load in the 20 gauge and have slightly less felt recoil out of the same weight or slightly lighter gun and have great patterns for the bore diameter. So to me, a 28 gauge fills that space of 35 yards and in, doves, teal, close range ducks. I want a quieter gun for closer work that's not going to spook birds, etc. 28 gauge. The 20 gauge can live in that space, slightly louder, but I can push it into the 16 gauge realm with the 3-inch Magnum. Don't push it into the 12 gauge load realm because it's there. Ounce and an eighth of a heavier non-tox like bismuth or ITX 10 or tungsten or like tungsten iron is fine. But you're starting to push out of that realm because an ounce and an eighth really belongs in a heavy 16 or a standard 12 load when you're looking at the pellet count, the pellet size that you're using for the game, and the shot charge height. So again, all of this is applicable not just to the 10 gauge versus the 12 gauge, but to every gauge looking one up and one down from a common commercially available gauge. Now, yes, there are 24s, and yes, there are 32s. And if you're stuck between the 410 bore and the 28 gauge, a 32 would work. You would have a lot of a project. It would be a big project to go through to get a gun and get loads together, etc. But it's possible, right? It would be okay. I can't make up my mind. This will be the best of both worlds. Maybe, I guess, sort of, kind of, not really. Maybe really, I don't know. But there is a reason why we've landed on these bore diameters, because they have proven to be the most efficient and ideal for their roles. That said, when looking specifically again at the 10 gauge, it makes more sense to think about slightly larger, slightly heavier, or significantly heavier shot charges of a dense material. In the waterfowl context, I would say the minimum would be bismuth. Steel shot does great, but even in the large pellet sizes that are, it's hard to get them to pattern right. So it's, again, every shot shell is a balance of lethality of the individual pellet and pellet count in pattern. You want even, dense patterns to kill birds. It can be argued that sometimes a more even, dense pattern kills a bird better than just big shot charges. I mean, if just big shot charges of big shot worked, we'd all be shooting 8 gauges with 50 caliber round balls. That would be the best thing ever, right? Well, no, not really. That'd be a terrible idea. But the point being, you just have to balance the load, right? And yes, the ideal material is lead, but we can't utilize that in North America legally for waterfowl hunting. So we were pushed in these other realms, and because of cost, we're pushed into the realm of lighter than lead non-toxins. I mean, I really wish that like TSS 15 and 18 were okay, because we'd all be shooting 28 gauges and 20 gauges on everything. I mean, we'd be taking swans with them at 50 yards with the pattern density we can achieve with those pellets, but that's not the case, so that's neither here nor there. But The point being, selecting a reasonable load with high efficacy is what you want to look for. Going with the heaviest possible doesn't mean anything if it doesn't pattern well and if it beats the living crap out of you, because at some point you'll develop a flinch, and at some point that is going to dramatically affect your shooting. Trust me, I've been shooting a 10 gauge in an ungodly amount, and I've been putting some pretty butt stomper loads together that, you know what, a Boss shot shell or a steel load out of the 10 is a very mild, pleasant experience. You start really playing with stuff with heavy buck and heavy turkey loads like I've been doing, and you will eventually develop a flinch. So you'll have trouble shooting slugs accurately, So there is that to consider. Pushing it as hard as you can doesn't mean shit if you can't make it count. So take that for what it may be to you. When looking at the 10 gauge loading market, especially in the past year and a half with the Kung Flu, the COVID, the Coof, whatever you want to call it, the pandemic, we've had both an easy ride in the first 6 months, and then we're starting to see in the 10 gauge world, and we have been seeing, that there are no hulls coming. There is no reinforcements, right? What we've got is what we got, and you kind of got to snap it up as you can. And unfortunately, it's a terrible time to get into reloading in general, but it's a terrible time to try and load the 10 gauge. So, yeah, we put out load videos, but it doesn't, it's not very helpful unless you already load for it. That being said, ideally, we would have a bunch of components to select from. And normally on the market, there are two short wads, the PT-1044 or the Gualandi wad, and the Remington SP-10 wad. And then for your tall wads, you have what are currently manufactured as the TPS, the Tungsten Propulsion System 10 by Ballistic Products, as well as their standard wad, their BPD wad, their BPD 10. Ballistic Products offers those two wads, and again, the PT-1044 is their rebranding of the Gualandi wad. Now, Precision Reloading does offer a proprietary base wad for their 10 gauge purposes. That is the TU PWR 105. So I've been affectionately calling it just the Tupper W. So the Tupper W, good load. It's a designed as an 1 5/8 steel load, shot cup, very thick, very even pedal spread when it is fired. So ideal for most loads. I think it's a great option for lead loads. You do need to play with it. I found better results with the TPS and the multi-metal wads than I did with the Tupper W. But that being said, it works and it does its job. So there are going to be benefits from it. My suggestion is, out of the 3 full-length 10 gauge wads, buy all 3. I have not played with it with buckshot yet, with smaller buckshot like the number 4 loads, so it could hold extreme potential for that. But I digress. You'll also find 10 gauge overshot cards. And let me not forget that, although I have no experience with it, there is the ability at times to find the Remington SAM 1 full-length wad that was developed again for steel shot, but works very well for high payload or high weight lead payloads, tungsten payloads, etc. Overshot cards are available, fiber wads are available, nitro cards are available, and then of course the very essential, because Federal doesn't offer theirs as a, perhaps they did at one point, but you cannot find them ever, the Federal bidirectional gas seal for the 10 gauge. But Gualandi, once again, comes to the rescue. Their gas seal works exceptionally, and I've seen no detriment to patterns with it. So you've got enough components there, enough wadding, to create some pretty butt stomper loads. Is it as significant and diverse as the 12 gauge market, for example? Absolutely not. But if you've got one or two of them on hand, you've got some options, especially considering all the powders carry over from 12 gauge to 10 gauge typically. And even stuff like Little Gun, which is ideal for 410 and 28 gauge, can be utilized for very high charge weight, like 3 ounce, 2 3/4 or 3 ounce loads of TSS or lead if you want to press it into that service. Standard shot shell loadings like felt wads that are, buffer wads, uh, that you're trying to bring the height or of the shot column or cushion it are available. I like putting a 20 gauge wad in some of my loads, a Turkey Thunder version 2.0, which I will feature at some point. That utilizes one of those. You've got Mylar wraps, Teflon wraps, mica wad slick, the precision reloading or ballistic products buffer. Precision reloading buffer, by the way, is ideal. I'll get into that some other time, but between the two, if you have a choice of either or, get the precision reloading. Trust me, you're going to like it better. It's a better buffer. But I digress. So there's that for waddings. Now for hulls, we have 4 hulls on the market normally. Asterisk to that, normally, not in 2021, but normally in years past. And those have been the Federal paper-based wad hull, which has issues, especially recently, and I'll get into that in a second. You have the Remington plastic-based wad hull, which is available factory fresh sometimes. Again, not in 2021, but sometimes. You have the Cheddite plastic-based wad hull, very reminiscent of the old red-hulled Winchester loads, and that is a great 1 or 2 loading hull, especially when loaded to full potential, or to the tits, as one might say. And unfortunately, those aren't available right now. Hopefully, we'll see them come in as the summer progresses or as we get towards fall. And then finally, the only one that is not commercially available for reloaders, it has to be reloaded, but maybe with the exception that it is the shortest of all the hulls, maybe the best hull and the most durable hull is the Winchester Double X black hull. Now that hull has been around for some time, but it is one of the newer hulls when it comes to the 10 gauge and is definitely an improvement over the older Winchesters. The color definitely was not the only change. They seem to have adjusted a few things, but I digress. Anyhow, the Winchester has a lot of capacity because it is slightly wider for their wad series and the thickness of the wad wall they look to have in their loadings. And they're using the same 2-piece wad, full-length wad for their turkey load as they are their steel shot loads from what I can see. I do need to pull apart one of each to confirm, but most of them are all pretty much identical as far as wadding goes. Again, I digress. But so there are your 4 hull options. Now, Boss Shot Shells uses the Cheddite hull. Remington is all Remington. Warwolf Ordnance uses both Cheddites and Remingtons. Federal uses the Federal hulls. There are other companies like Nitro Company, I believe, use the Remington or the Federal hull. But if you talk to 10 gauge loaders, typically the Remington hull is the preferred hull because of its capacity, its height, its load characteristics, and its durability. The Federal hull is a hit or miss, and for me, it's a definite miss at this point. And I'll go into, again, I alluded to it being a problem before, but I'll go into that in a second. But honestly, if I have my choice of all 4, if I could get factory fresh Winchesters and factory fresh Remingtons all day long, that's what I would shoot. But when it comes to general availability, the Cheddite hull is a good hull. It just expands a lot. It can give rough chambered guns a headache with extraction. It also is not the most durable hull. You'll get, in my opinion, from a fresh hull to what's its life cycle, with mild loads, about 3 or 4 is pushing it. With Magnum loads, 2. I have seen a number of the hulls tear at the base after having ran through them about 2 full house number 4 buck loadings or turkey loadings. Uh, so I typically cycle out my Cheddite hulls to be short shells or to um, be just recycled or thrown away after 2 Magnum loadings. So I try to keep track of that. But the Cheddites are still, they're an affordable price point. They make sense for guys that just want a primed, fresh hull to throw high quality hunting loads together. Uh, Especially if you're going to be in a situation where you're not going to be able to recover them, they're not that great of a loss. I place Federal hulls right there next to them. The Federal steel loads and turkey loads never seem to have a problem, but I have seen shearing at the base transition as well as an inch to up to an inch, inch and a quarter above it, tearing or shearing of the hull with higher weight. But an ounce and a half seems to be okay with a slug or with steel loads. But higher weight turkey loads and buckshot loads seem to not agree whatsoever with the Federal hull. And there is some quality control issues when it comes to the Federal hull as well. So there is that to consider, and I will eventually do a video on that once I figure out how to determine what hulls are good and what hulls are bad. But I recently, before this podcast, had a series of bad hulls that I did not discover, of course, until I'm trying to complete filming on a load video, and now I've got hull failures and I can't get pattern shot and I can't demonstrate because I just loaded up a bunch of buckshot that fails and sends the whole thing downrange like a cut shell. And sometimes the patterns are insane and sometimes the patterns are just blown to pieces. So obviously that's not ideal. But I digress. Anyhow, so there's my thoughts on the 10 gauge Magnum in the last year and a half. I guess it's just a rambling of notes, really just covering, we just went through it. Why I decided on the 10, why I got into it, ideal, loadings, how to pick a load, load data. And again, even when loading, you're probably going to find the best results and have the best time with sticking to published data or tinkering around with what's going to work best in your gun that has high efficiency and isn't wasting a bunch of components or more than what's needed to get the job done. You're using a 10 for a reason. Keep it in 10 realm. Try not to push it to 8 gauge power levels if you can. Although I know pushing the boundaries is quite fun and really exciting at times. Be safe though, guys. If you are hand loading, and if you're venturing off a beaten path, you're taking it into your own hands. So just be accepting of that and always be careful. Lead sleds and lanyards and guns are cheaper than hands, fingers, eyes, and lives. So always be safe, guys, and always use your top knot. Use what God put on your top of your shoulders for more than a place to put your hat. My fatherly saying of the podcast. Anyways, this one's getting long in the tooth. I hope you enjoyed listening to my ramblings. We'll be back again at some point with another podcast. As always, God bless. Keep your powder dry. I'll see you in the next one, guys.